The concepts of religious language are studied in order to show that religious language can maybe be meaningful. In particular, this film intends to show that the religious language is potentially analogical. If we understand it in the form of analogy or comparison, then we can see it can have meaning. This approach is particularly championed by Aquinas, Ramsey, and Hick, who see religious language as meaningful. Aquinas pointed out that two forms of language could be identified that we might use to talk about God. The first is univocal language. This is when the word used in two different contexts has been used for the exact same reasons. So speaking of Steve's love and God's love would have the same connotations attached. This helps to make God understandable. We know what love means to us as humans. However, this form of language is insufficient when talking about God. This is because, as Aquinas said, no name belongs to God in the same sense that it belongs to creatures. There is a risk that if we use the word in a univocal manner, then we will misunderstand God's true nature. So univocal language is inappropriate. The second form of language Aquinas identified was equivocal language. This is used when applying the same word to two different things. For example, calling your cat good, but also calling God good. Calling your cat good would have a different meaning compared with calling God good. Likewise, the love which God has would be on a different level to the love which Steve might have for you, but still the same word is used. Since the definitions of words have to change when referring back to God, there is a risk of making God's qualities so different to that of humans that understanding of God is impossible, or there is a risk of subjectivity so that we can never conclusively understand one meaning of the language that is used. Aquinas saw that all good qualities in humans come from God, and so are related to him. God's goodness might be greater, but the basic meaning comes from the God-given qualities which we have. Thus he claimed that there is a third type of language, analogy, which helps us to speak meaningfully about God by comparing him to contingent things. Analogical language is a compromise between univocal and equivocal language. It allows people to have a fixed meaning to their words, and thus talk of God is knowable and meaningful. In addition, it allows for the fact that our human empirical language is insufficient and may need to be interpreted in order to understand it. This allows us to speak in a meaningful way about God. Aquinas said that our talk of God may be accurate without being comprehensive. In addition, analogy is possible because God is our efficient cause. There is a point of comparison between us and God because God is our creator, and thus the cause must have the characteristics that it passes on to the effect. Since God has made us, we can reasonably infer that his qualities may in some way be similar to ours, whilst recognizing that they might not be identical. All language about God is therefore analogical, because we cannot speak of him without using a comparison with what we can know empirically. Colin Brown says, because of religious experience, analogical language is appropriate and meaningful. Aquinas divided analogical language into different types because we use these marks of comparison in different ways. Essentially, there are two different types of analogy, attribution and proportion, but these in themselves can be applied in different ways or on a different basis, and so we can see other potential divisions or types of analogies are possible. Firstly, the analogy of attribution. This is essentially the idea that due to causality, there is a point of comparison that can be made between earthly things and God. This was a premise of the cosmological argument, and it was postulated by Aristotle, who influenced Aquinas significantly. We know that due to the operation of causality, things that are in existence are always caused by other things. Aquinas shows that the characteristics that are attributed to God can be referred to meaningfully through intrinsic and extrinsic attribution. If we were to use extrinsic attribution to talk about God, then it would be because he is our efficient cause. It is meaningful to make a comparison since we are the effect that he caused. Here, however, the characteristic is wrought by the cause but does not possess the characteristic itself. For instance, health is caused by medicine, but medicine does not have to possess health as a characteristic. This comparison can be made in two different ways. In efficient causality, there is a mark of comparison simply because the cause is bringing the effect, the characteristic, about, such as with the medicine example. If we use similarity of relations, then there is no similarity in reality, but the relationship is what is being compared. For instance, a smile on a face is like flowers in a meadow. Here the two things are not similar, but since a smile brightens and changes a facial appearance, flowers may do the same thing to a field. Aquinas generally rejects extrinsic attribution for the intrinsic kind. Intrinsic attribution is where the cause is both the cause and the effect. For instance, as in a self-portrait. Here, if I create a self-portrait, then I am the cause because I am producing the painting, but I am also the effect because it is me that is being created. This is evident in religious language, such as God creating Imago Dei. He makes us in his image, and thus is both the cause and the effect. Aquinas pointed out that the cause imposes its character on the effect, and so we can see that our characteristics must be part of God's character too. In the first way of the cosmological argument, Aquinas used the example that in order for wood to become hot, it would be acted upon by fire which is already hot. This is also biblically acceptable, since God has created us in his image. In this Old Testament extract, we can see the analogy being used because he is described as wise and powerful. This is because he is the efficient cause of wisdom and power. He gives the power and wisdom to those that are powerful and wise in this world. Hence this is a quality he possesses and he brings it about in others. Thus it is intrinsic attribution. In this extract, we can clearly see intrinsic attribution where God is both the cause and the effect. This means that language claiming that God is good, for instance, may be seen as meaningful because if we see goodness in humanity, and if God has created us in his image, then we can accurately, if not comprehensively, describe God as being good too. Another form of analogical language that might be used is analogy of proportion. In this instance, the scale on which the comparison is being made is important. When I describe God as good, it might be accurate, but I cannot mean it in exactly the same way as I do when I talk about humanity. I must recognise that God is greater than we are, and so must have a greater form of goodness than I do. Here we can say that we can mean it either literally in the sense that I make a real comparison with a real characteristic that God actually has, or I mean it metaphorically, such as when I describe God as a rock. I don't mean that he's literally grey and hard. I mean that the characteristics I see in rocks, such as stability or endurance, are characteristics that can be scaled up when I apply them to God. Here we can see real proportion being used. Wisdom is a characteristic we see in humanity, but in comparison with the wisdom of God that he possesses, it is like foolishness. We must understand that this characteristic must be scaled up when we are talking about the wisdom of God, because he has it perfectly. Here we can see metaphorical proportion being used, since God is not literally a word like it appears here on your screen. He is not light in the same way that a light from a bulb or a candle shines. It is a metaphor. But we must scale this metaphor up when talking about God. He is the Word, he is the light, giving ultimate truth and illumination. Hick's explanation of analogy is notable here also. He speaks of analogies being scaled in either direction. We can scale an analogy upwards from ourselves when we talk about God. If I speak of God being faithful, then I mean it in a much greater way than when I talk about human beings. When I say my dog is faithful, I mean it in a lesser way. I scale it downwards, since a dog is not capable of the cognitive function of a human, yet can and does display similar characteristics and behaviour. For Ian Ramsey, analogies can be divided into models and qualifiers. A model is the analogy that is made when we want to make a comparison in order to say something about God. Here, the model is good, since it is the thing which we are familiar with in this world and can be used to help us understand something unfamiliar. Here we help people to understand by using words or ideas that they already know. For instance, if I want to help my students understand something about a religious ritual, I might make a comparison with something they already know, such as a race or a game. I might point out that before a rugby match, the All Blacks have a ritual haka that they perform in order to cement them together as a group and achieve focus for the upcoming game. A religious ritual might have some areas of similarity, in that for a Hindu, for example, they might use group worship at the temple to ensure that the group of Hindus are cemented together as a group and are focused on the avatar or god that they're worshipping. However, what is different is the object of focus and the reason for the ritual. The object of focus for the religious person is something eternal, not something earthly. There is an attempt at connecting with the divine, and so here we have a qualifier. The qualifier is the word which usually accompanies the model. It helps us to understand the model and shows how it is to be developed. It helps us to understand how to interpret the model and that it is not to be understood in a completely literal sense. Qualifiers lead to a new depth of understanding. Ramsey used phrases such as the penny drops or the light dawns to explain this. The qualifiers are what lead a person to commitment as they discern depth when the qualifier works. One of the many examples he used was of a formal setting in a high court, where Mr. Justice Brown, the judge, dressed in a wig and robe, meets the accused, who happens to be a best friend from his days as a student. An odd, out-of-context word is used, Sammy, the judge's name to his friend, and this changes the situation entirely. It causes the judge to see the accused in a different light. When a model is qualified, it is as though an odd word has been used, and this causes insight to be gained. In Ramsey's word, the court is electrified as the impersonal situation becomes personal.